Thanks, Charlie. Welcome, brothers. Good to see you, brothers and sisters. Nothing better than to look out over the organized arm of the working class of this country, ready to fight back. That's always inspiring to me. So, in this country today, you got different sort of models of how we should deal with enterprise, with the whole nature of work, and with our country, right? So in terms of employers in this country, the largest non-government employer, as you may know, is Walmart, which is kind of one model of a workplace, probably one most of us don't think much of. The second largest directly non-governmental employer is the United States Postal Service, which is a very different model of how to have an employer and an employment relationship. We certainly have our problems at work. We have the advantage of our other federal brothers and sisters that thanks to a massive illegal strike in 1970 and during a time when there was so much upheaval in this country that we got what we wanted, we actually have collective bargaining and over everything with the Postal Service. So we have an advantage there. But as so much the theme of today of all this private public sector activity, of course, is under attack, right? Because all of this, everything that's public should be destroyed and turned into a profit-making operation. And so it's hard to do that when something like the U.S. Postal Service is the most popular institution in the country. All surveys, it's the most popular, absolutely the most beloved federal institution, and it's the fourth most trusted company in the United States. And it's, you know, the most efficient postal system in the world, the least expensive, everything else, even though we have a very diverse population compared to many other countries. And so the problem always has been for right-wingers, how do you attack that? They would usually just come up with bills in Congress to privatize it outright. This guy Crane from Illinois used to always do that, and it just pretty much fell flat. We would always fight that. But it's like so much of what you see today, the strategy is to starve the thing to death and then say, oh my God, there's a crisis, we're broke. You know, so you starve the schools and say, yeah, normally we like to educate kids, but oh my God, we can't afford it, there's no alternative, you know, we're broke. Because you starved it out by eliminating all the taxes that supported it to begin with. So that was their strategy with the Postal Service. They passed in 2006 the Postal Service Enhancement Act, Accountability and Enhancement Act. And one thing, and many of you know this, I'm going to go over this very briefly, but so one thing you always have to know about the Postal Service, and make sure you know it and keep it in your brain and tell your friends, the Postal Service gets no federal money at all. Our entire operation is financed by the stamps you buy, the services we sell. That's what finances the Postal Service. Has done so very successfully since 1970. And so what they had to do was somehow make this very successful operation look not successful. So they put in, many of you know it, in that time, as provision that we had to pre-fund, not our retirement system, that's part of the federal retirement system, we had to pre-fund federal retiree health benefits for the next 75 years and pay for it in 10 years. That was the idea, right? So, because this was a lingering liability. Well, the only reason, I mean, nobody does that, right? No other institution, no private company, they would all say you're nuts if you suggest that. They did it allegedly because, well, the thing might go belly up and then there'd be this liability, or especially if we'd like to sell it off, we don't want this liability sitting there if we want to privatize it. So they make the Postal Service prepay for people who haven't even been born yet, their retiree health benefits. And so what that meant was we would start out every year $5.8 billion in the hole and dig your way out of it, which we did very successfully for a number of years until the recession hit, which then affected mail volume, and then we weren't able to do that anymore. So we were still making money. The Postal Service now, every year, is making money, hundreds of millions of dollars, but they keep saying, well, we're in the hole, we're sinking deeper and deeper in the hole because of this $5.8 billion a year. It's a completely phony thing. And it's a phony thing to just make it look like the Postal Service isn't working, right? So you can say, oh my God, we're broke, there's no alternative, we have to privatize this or radically change it. So that has been the justification for all sorts of draconian things they've tried to do, all the way from closing many small town post offices. They said, well, we have to do this. They don't make money. Of course, the whole idea of the Postal Service is, yeah, they don't make money in Elkhart, Iowa, but they make a lot of money in New York, and it all balances out, and we provide a universal service to everybody. Well, so they went after that. At least that we got slowed down, so now they just instead cut down to reduce the hours in many small towns and kept them open. But so they used that to try to justify to go to 5-day delivery, to eliminate a whole day of delivery for people that depend on medicines and all kinds of things, need 6-day delivery, and they tried to go to 5. They tried to close, and are continuing to try to close processing plants to reduce the processing capability of our plants to get the mail there on time. And to do that, to justify that, to delay delivery standards, so that where mail used to be overnight, it would be 2 days, 3 days, we'll get it there. What is it? We'll deliver no mail before it's time or whatever, like wine or whatever it is. So, so those have been the attacks we've been under that you've already known about, we've talked about in the past. And that's an ongoing struggle. And at the same time, and of course, part of the frustration we have is that our own management in Washington, you would think, well, okay, they're running the Postal Service. They're trying to do it. They're committed to the existence of the Postal Service, and they're suffering these attacks from the rest of the government somehow. No, they're pretty much in league with the mailing industry, who wants to privatize all that. What their vision is, they want it to be what they call the last mile of delivery, that everything about the Postal Service is privatized except the part that isn't profitable, which is going to every house every day, right? Because UPS and all these places don't want to do that, and so they want us to be the final, which would ultimately cost you taxpayer money ultimately to run if everything else is, all the profitable parts of it are privatized. The one thing that isn't profitable, to going to every house every day in the whole country, whether you live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon or in Puerto Rico or in Alaska, that's not profitable, and that's what they would be left with, so that the public ultimately it would be a massive delivery operation for corporate America, and that's all there would be to it. And so, but one of the things that has come up that people have proposed is, rather than like the government in general, or Social Security, other things we've talked about, rather than choking and destroying and privatizing this, why not expand this? The Postal Service is the only institution we know in Iowa, in many small towns, it's certainly the only presence of the government in any way. Why not instead use that footprint there to expand that and to bring more services to more people? And one of the innovative things that has been proposed was proposed by other people, and actually, surprisingly in some ways to us, was the subject of a report by the Office of Inspector General of the Postal Service, not usually an institution we're on good terms with. They're usually out trying to trap and bust our members. But on postal banking, which is one of the things I want to go over, just give you a little report on the whole concept of postal banking, which has become a big issue, and one that our union has put together a large coalition of people to push for. Since this idea has been written by John Nichols in The Nation, if you see that, and it has now been taken up by Senator Warren as a popular idea, and Bernie Sanders in his campaigns has made this a large idea. That in fact, we had a postal bank before, and I'll go through this a little bit, and much of the world has postal banking with trillions of dollars of assets, and particularly what this would solve is solve a number of problems. In this country, there's a huge number of people who are what they call unbanked or underserved. They live in neighborhoods, and these are particularly rural areas and inner cities both, who are increasingly not covered by banking, who for one reason or another, they estimate in fact that the underserved population of U.S. households is something like 68 million adults who are not served or underserved by banking, and because of that, they turn to other alternatives at outrageous interest rates and so forth. To do this, and they spend about $89 billion just on interest and fees to these alternative sources that they turn to. Banks are increasingly closing branches around the country, and mostly in low-income areas, rural areas, inner cities. And on average, these alternative, the payday loans and all these sort of things, drive people, of course, into increasing poverty. And they talk about that in terms of the costs of people, of these costs, that the average person who filed for bankruptcy in 2012, for instance, turned out they were $26 a month short of meeting their expenses. This is the kind of, the small margin that so many working people live on. And those outrageous payday and other bloodthirsty financial arrangements contribute to that tremendously. And so it's estimated that with these, if that $89 billion, if you offered these services tremendously less expensively through the Postal Service, as we did once before. We had small savings accounts. This was something that was started in 1911, and the idea was to promote savings so that people didn't put it in a coffee can and bury it in the backyard. They did, there was a more safe alternative for people. And a lot of, particularly immigrants, have always used that system and had billions of dollars in assets in the U.S. And only after, it was very popular up until about during the war, and after the war, banks finally started to offer higher interest rates, and there was more sort of accessibility to alternatives, and slowly the usage went down, and they finally closed it down in the 1960s. But what this would enable, so, excuse me here. So of these people who are underserved, it's surprising to some extent who some of them are. More than half of the underserved households by banks earn less than $30,000 a year, but more than a quarter earn at least $50,000. A full 57% are employed, just 10% are unemployed, and a third are not in the labor force, usually because they're disabled or retired. And nearly half of the underserved actually have attended at least some level of college. So it's not just homeless people or that kind of thing. Banks, as I said, are continuing to close branches around the country. They've closed over 2,000 branches. And by contrast, the Postal Service is everywhere, in all of these areas. In fact, 59% of the zip codes where we have post offices, 59% have no bank or only one bank. And so those areas, we are present, the areas where banks are not, and would be an alternative to these people. Of course, needless to say, the public has no faith in banks anyway with the financial crisis and so forth, whereas they have tremendous faith in the Postal Service and the reliability of it. So yeah, there was a bank from 1911 to 1967, which reached $3.4 billion in assets and was, as I said, finally phased out just because at that time in the 60s, there seemed to be a lot of other alternatives. But so an example, for instance, if you had one of the things they're talking about is creating a postal card where you could even load your paycheck onto it, for instance, where there would be no fees, unlike the cards they try to make people put their checks on now. You could get a federal, your federal tax return loaded onto it, whatever. This would all be with no fees that you could use anywhere. You could you could do check cashing for free, of course, at post offices, and do all of those kind of services through a small card where you could pay bills with it and everything else, and there would be no fees on it. And even do small loans. They estimate, for instance, that many people, for instance, if you borrowed $375 through the current payday loan systems, they usually, those are usually set up to be paid off. That would, in that case, would be set up to be paid off maybe in 5 months. Typically, people keep having to go back and back to it, where they'd be paying $99 a month bi-monthly. If you did that with the Postal Service with the rates they would estimate, you'd pay $38, and as opposed to $520 over the life of the thing, which would be 391% interest, you'd pay $48 at 28% total interest and save hundreds of dollars for the people who have to turn to some kind of an alternative. So if even just 10% of that activity was diverted to the Postal Service, even at these tremendously cheaper rates, the Postal Service at the same time would profit to the rate they estimate of about $8 or $9 billion and still save working people about $80 billion on those expenses. So this particular report theorizes it in terms of sort of partnering with banks. That's questionable perhaps, because of course now it is major banks who aren't the payday lenders but underwrite the payday lenders. All that money comes from major banks that underline that. But this is something anyway where we are fighting.
A lot of the smaller rural areas have talked about closing their post offices and or they have to go to a post office. They don't get, delivery to their homes and that type of thing. How are you going to offer them banking when their postal services are being cut?
Well, as I said, I think initially there was a move to close a lot of post offices. A few were closed. Actually, not very many. Finally, what they came up with was something they call Post Plan, which what it did was there's different levels of post offices. It can become a little complicated, but basically the smallest offices now, instead they have them part-time. So they're open 2 hours a day. The next tier are open 4 hours a day and 6 hours a day. So most of them are not closing, they just reduce their hours, which we opposed, but it is a lot better than closing them altogether. So that presence is still there. And yeah, well, there's always been rural free delivery, right, which actually began in Iowa. The first rural free delivery began over by Morning Sun in eastern Iowa. But it's always been the case that in small towns, people go to the post office to get their mail. They don't have home delivery. And of course they're trying, that was part of the other thing they were trying to do was stop home delivery in cities. If new neighborhoods are built, you have what's called a cluster box down the street, you have to go get your mail. They were trying to go back and force that into, existing neighborhoods, which we fought and along with our brothers in the Letter Carriers Union have fought very hard to try to prevent that from happening. But I understand your. Yeah, it's a good point. Thanks, brother. It's not like this is coming out of the thin air. We already do a significant amount of financial transactions. We do electronic international transfers of money already through with a bunch of Latin American countries called Sigero Dinero, and so this this is really just expanding a little bit something that we already do. Right? It's not, which is part of the report of this OIG report. Is it's not like coming up with something out of thin air. It's just sort of expanding work that we already do financially and as a great benefit to working people in our communities. So.
All right, thank you very much, Bruce. Appreciate the update.